Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving into a really fascinating study today by Dr. Kwabena Obeng Asiyama. It takes a hard look at a massive conflict happening in Uganda right now, basically the intense friction between big national economic development and local informal land rights.
Exactly. And honestly, the expertise behind this research is just incredible. Dr. Asiyama is the chair of the International Federation of Surveyors, or FFIG, Commission 8. He's also a senior lecturer at KNUST in Ghana and the managing partner of the Center for Property Investment. Plus, this incredibly impactful study was backed by heavy hitters like UN Habitat, FIG, and the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors.
It's an absolutely essential piece of work. It takes us straight into the heart of something called the Buvuma Oil Palm Plantation Project. Which brings us right to the core question of our explainer. Think about this for a second. How do you value land that, officially at least, doesn't actually belong to you? It creates this really tricky illusion of fairness. On paper, everyone gets paid market value. But in reality, how do you put a price tag on a community's completely undocumented right to just survive?
Right, you really can. It's a total clash between rigid, formal legal frameworks and the deeply complex, informal realities of how people actually live and use land in sub-Saharan Africa.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start by untangling Uganda's complex land tenure system, then walk through the Buvuma Plantation Project itself. After that, we'll dig into the actual valuation clash, look closely at how this impacted vulnerable communities, and finally talk about how to fix this broken framework. Let's get into it. Okay, let's kick things off by looking at Uganda's land tenure system. To really grasp this conflict, we have to understand the massive gap between formal laws and informal realities. Because Uganda has this totally unique mosaic of land interests. You can't just look at a map, draw a square, and see who owns what. The reality is heavily, heavily layered.
Absolutely. Nationally, customary land tenure absolutely dominates. We're talking almost 70% of the entire country. But if you look at the central region, which is where Buvuma is located, things shift. There's a uniquely high concentration of something called Milo tenure there. It makes up nearly 30% of the land in that specific area.
And this Milo system, that is where things get legally fascinating and honestly, heavily contested. Milo basically creates this wild dual ownership setup. On one side, you have the Milo landlords. They hold the formal title, but they are very often absentee owners. They might live in the city and just collect a nominal rent.
Yeah, and then on the flip side, you have the Kibanja tenants. Imagine living somewhere your whole entire life. You own the house, you own the crops you planted, but you do not have the official piece of paper for the dirt underneath it all. That's the Kibanja reality. They are technically unregistered, but they are legally protected occupants. So when the government rolls in and wants to buy this land, they are suddenly dealing with two entirely different sets of rights existing on the exact same plot.
Which brings us nicely to the Buvuma Plantation Project itself, which was this massive, strategic, national effort. We are talking about a 10,000-hectare project. It was designed to reduce Uganda's reliance on imported edible oils, create jobs, and really stimulate the rural economy. And on paper, the acquisition process was totally standard. They initiate the project, consult the stakeholders, run the valuation, and pay the compensation. Perfectly logical, right? The Milo landlord agrees to sell, the government figures out the value, and the occupants get a check. Simple. Right. Simple on paper. But here's the reality check. 205. That's the number of project-affected persons who formally contested their compensation. When this very neat, formal acquisition process crashed headfirst into the undocumented reality of Kibanja tenants and squatters, well, chaos ensued. Identifying who actually lived on the land, let alone valuing their livelihoods, became incredibly messy. And that mess brings us to the core valuation clash. How do you actually value unregistered land? This is exactly where the systemic friction happens. Professional valuers who are trained in traditional market economics try to slap a strict market value onto informal land arrangements. Dr. Asiyama's study includes this incredible quote from a government valuer. They said, "A river belongs to government. If it's like livelihood restoration, that's an area that is still, we are trying to find our way around it." Basically, because the state formally owns the water bodies, people who rely on the lake to survive technically have no compensable property interest when they lose access to it. And that rigid view completely misses the reality on the ground. The study brings in the academic perspective here, noting that for long maturing crops, the strict market value becomes very, very small. Think about it. If you are a subsistence farmer with a mature stand of banana or oil palm trees, standard district compensation rates completely fail to capture the actual decades-long income stream you are losing. A strict market rate just fundamentally doesn't reflect the livelihood reality. And making matters so much worse was this staggering information asymmetry. Get this, only 18% of surveyed households actually understood the valuation process well enough to participate in it. That means a massive 82% did not fully understand what was happening. These local occupants were practically locked out of the highly technical conversations that were literally deciding their futures. So let's pivot from the theory of valuation to the human element, the actual impacts on vulnerable communities. We have to look at who really paid the price for this economic progress. Take the fishing communities, for example. Because the water is state-owned, their generations of unregistered reliance on that lake were legally invisible. Poof! They lost waterfront access and got zero compensation for losing their primary livelihood. They were essentially forced into growing oil palm or trying their hand at petty commerce, with nowhere near enough support for such a massive life transition. And these impacts were also deeply, tragically gendered. We saw this in earlier projects in Kalangala too. Legally correct cash payouts usually went to male heads of households, and sometimes those men took the money and abandoned their families. In Buvuma, women who actually did the hard work cultivating the land were often just classified as licensees, so when the land was acquired, they lost their cultivation space and were left totally landless, receiving absolutely no direct compensation themselves. Yeah, and on top of that, there's another profound loss that a calculator literally cannot tally. 40% of the surveyed households had to relocate sociocultural assets. We are talking about shrines, sacred trees, family cemeteries. Market value compensation frameworks fundamentally struggle and honestly usually fail entirely to address deep spiritual and cultural disruptions like this. You simply can't go look up the open market price of a sacred ancestral site. But it's not all bleak. The study does offer a path forward to fix this framework. Dr. Asiyama doesn't just point out the flaws, he gives us a concrete way to bridge the gap between formal legal structures and the lived reality of informal tenure. The real game changer here is a concept called participatory adjudication. All this means is running a systematic, deeply inclusive process to identify and record all those unregistered land rights, the kabanja tenants, the squatters, the fishermen, before any monetary valuation even begins. If you secure those rights up front, you basically eliminate the massive chaos and disputes that explode post-acquisition. Exactly. Ultimately, the study presents some really clear, actionable recommendations. First, we need to systematically issue certificates of occupancy to give these informal tenants actual legal standing. Second, we must align national policies with international standards, like the UN's VGGT guidelines. Third, we have to integrate social and economic rights into the valuation process. We have to move way beyond mere market value. And crucially, we must ensure true, free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC. It's really about protecting the most vulnerable by recognizing their actual reality, not just what's on the paperwork. So we want to leave you with a final, provocative thought. As global demand continues to drive this kind of massive agricultural expansion everywhere, how can we ensure that economic progress doesn't completely erase the undocumented rights of the world's most vulnerable people?
It's a heavy question, and it goes far, far beyond Uganda. It touches literally every corner of the developing world, where formal laws meet informal lives. We really hope this explainer gave you a new lens through which to view land rights and valuation. Thanks so much for learning with us today.